Order. The honourable member for Dundas.
Mr.
Ruddock.
Mr. Deputy Speaker, the speech of the honourable member for Stirling, who has preceded me, I think was a very welcome contribution, and the comments from members of this side of the House were testimony to that. Mr. Deputy Speaker, no one who has seen the horror and destruction of war would lightly advocate or support hostilities as a desirable means to attain political objectives. Yesterday, in a service at St Mary's Cathedral in Sydney, in memorial to the people in Lithuania who recently lost their lives, Cardinal Clancy said there is perhaps only one greater obscenity than war. He described the tyranny of dictatorship, loss of freedom, oppression of individuals by force, and submission by occupation. He was, of course, describing the situation in the Baltic states, but the lesson is of general application. The maimed men and women and children crippled by war in Cambodia are only matched by the horror of Pol Pot's killing fields on his own people. The events in the Middle East are not a contest of ideas or ideals, not about oil or resources, even though incidentally related, but it's about the future of human relationships in a very troubled world. 1990 showed signs of becoming the genesis of a new world order. From the first crack in the Berlin Wall in November 1989, the collapse of physical and ideological barriers that divided Europe and the world so dangerously for most of this century proceeded rapidly, and for the most part with less anguish and bloodshed than could have been previously imagined. Germany is united. The Warsaw Pact has been dissolved. Democratic reforms sweeping Eastern Europe, though welcomed, will produce results that are as unpredictable as were the events that led to these remarkable developments in the first place. The end of the Cold War and the evolving relationship between the United States of America and the USSR have given us hope for the future of a world order characterised by peace, security and freedom. But there are two significant events which have now cast a shadow of enormous proportion over these developments. First, the events in the Baltic states of Lithuania and Latvia, which have led to the tragic loss of 14 lives. Totally without justification, the Soviet Union seems determined to stifle any reasonable aspirations of the Baltic peoples to elementary self-determination. And under the shadow of the Gulf War, that cannot be covered up. It grieved me greatly to see and share the anguish of the Baltic people of Australia as these events have occurred. And secondly, we have the events of the Middle East, where in an assumed power vacuum, Saddam Hussein of Iraq has moved to take a pan-Arab leadership role and brutally occupy his neighbouring country, Kuwait. This development has singularly altered the strategic landscape of the Middle East. The world is not yet free of dangerous ambitions, animosities, suspicion and greed. Thus, as 1990 drew to a close, the events of the Persian Gulf were to provide a test case for the embryonic new order, and how it is resolved will provide a powerful impetus to the direction of global security for the remainder of this century and into the next. Saddam Hussein's invasion of Kuwait demonstrates that international lawlessness remains a feature of international relations. Underlying his actions was a belief that the rest of the world and its international agencies were impotent to act in the face of such naked aggression. That invasion of a sovereign state was legitimate method through which he could pursue his aims. However, the rapid response of the United States, the willingness of the Soviet Union to cooperate on this issue, and the unanimity of view of the members of the Security Council of the United Nations in imposing sanctions against Iraq were all encouraging signs that in this body, the United Nations, we might at last be able to realise hopes upon which it was founded. Chapter 1 of the United Nations Charter states the purposes of the United Nations are, first, to maintain international peace and security, and to that end, to take collective measures for the prevention and removal of threats to peace and for the suppression of acts of aggression or other breaches of peace, and to bring about by peaceful means and in conformity with the principles of justice and international law, adjustment or settlement of international disputes or situations which might lead to a breach of peace. And in its preamble, to ensure by the acceptance of principles and the institution of methods that armed force shall not be used save in the common interest. Now, these noble sentiments, in the end, can only be upheld when they are backed by legitimate force. The response of the majority of other Arab states to support the UN in sanctions against Iraq was also remarkable. Egypt and Syria joined with Saudi Arabia to make up a total of 28 United Nations member states contributing to forces in the Gulf. This represented an important addition to the effort to implement the UN resolutions that Iraq must withdraw from Kuwait. The imposition of a stringent trade embargo against Iraq was a concerted attempt by the nations of the world, under the authority of the United Nations, to find a peaceful method to end the Iraqi occupation. However, after several months, it is clear that sanctions alone would not force an Iraqi withdrawal. Simple observation from an independent press, along with intelligence reports, suggests that the borders of Iraq are more than porous and substantial supplies were still finding their way into that country. Further, the resolve of President Hussein to survive the sanctions was underestimated. Iraq is a police state, a dictatorship which is capable of enforcing compliance of its people through the most barbaric means. Some people defend his regime on the basis of cultural and religious differences, to which we should pay special regard. Unfortunately for those, little emphasis is placed upon our culture and its emphasis on the sanctity of life and freedom of choice and the individual. There should be no doubt that the regime under which Hussein has subjected his people and the people of Kuwait after his brutal invasion exemplifies the most flagrant violation of human rights. Amnesty International, which we in this Parliament accord a special and unique credibility, has detailed documentations of these violations, referring specially to the continued and increasing acts of torture, arrests, summary executions, disappearances and abductions. Among the atrocities committed after the invasion of Kuwait, Iraqi forces tortured and executed hundreds of people, including boys as young as 15. Testimony of the Kuwaiti refugees is a horrifying picture of widespread arrests, torture under interrogation, summary executions and extrajudicial killings. And you see in this paper that I have before me, case after case detailed in the most comprehensive way of the most barbarous acts one human being could commit on another. If I could incorporate it in Hansard, Mr. Deputy Speaker, I would want to incorporate the methods of torture and of ill treatment documented and used against the people of Kuwait. Some 36 individual methods of brutality in relation to other human beings of a most excruciating character. Whether it's the gouging out of eyes, the hammering of nails into hands, the piercing of skins with pins and staplers, whether it's the sexual deprivation that is mentioned, the description is horrifying in the least. I can understand why President Bush read it and cried. Arbitrary arrest and unfair trial of political prisoners, including prisoners of conscience, continue in Iraq. torture and the application of punishments which constitute cruel and inhuman and degrading treatment remain widespread. Even during times of war, nations should be expected to abide by international standards on the protection of civilians and allow access to war zones by representatives of humanitarian organisations, especially the International Committee on the Red Cross and its brother organisation, the Red Crescent. Both have been consistently denied access by Iraq. Iraq is in breach of the 4th Geneva Convention on the Treatment of Civilians in Time of War and deserves vigorous condemnation from the international community. Iraq has continued to show its contempt for the rule of law internationally. Not content to hold innocent foreign nationals as hostages before the outbreak of war in direct contravention of Resolution 663, Hussein continues to engage non-combatants in conflict, and I of course refer to the Scud missile attacks on civilian populations in Israel. Even today, it parades several prisoners of war in the most humiliating fashion before Iraqi audiences, again in contravention of Geneva Conventions. The barbarism of this man rivals that of Germany's Adolf Hitler and Cambodia's Pol Pot. As each of them have been indicted by the international community in victory, serious consideration needs to be given to war crimes trials and prosecution of this man, Saddam Hussein. Israel is clearly a non-combatant in this conflict. The bombings of its cities is Hussein's attempt to bring it into it and hence create divisions in the United Nations coalition. However, Egypt and Syria both appear to have reaffirmed their commitment to the coalition, even if Israel retaliates. Israel has shown extraordinary and commendable restraint by refusing to retaliate, although in international law it has every entitlement to do so. But other combatants have also been engaged. Hussein has repeatedly called for pro-Iraqis around the world to unite in a jihad, a holy war against Western interests, and we've witnessed evidence of this in the Philippines, Thailand, the United States, Europe, Pakistan and Indonesia. For all of these reasons, for the type of aggressor we are facing and his vision of dominating the world, the international community is utterly correct in checking the advances of Iraq, in committing its forces with the United Nations coalition in the Persian Gulf. Australia has acted not only in its own interests,
Mr. Ruddock,
but in the interests of the international community. None of this should be seen as an essentially warmongering posture by the members of the United Nations coalition in the Persian Gulf. It cannot be forgotten that the central issue here is the unprovoked invasion by a sovereign member of the international community by a recalcitrant neighbour, and the threat that this posed to the security not only of other states but to the entire region. We did not want war. It is a fallacy to suggest that the UN actions in this conflict caused the war. The Middle East consists of regimes which could hardly be called democratic by Western standards and in which perpetuation of human rights violations are endemic. Iraq has long nursed ambitions of a pan-Arabian nation. The Ba'athist Party, which Hussein leads, is committed to creating a single united Arab nation stretching from North Africa to the Iranian border. With Iraq's probable defeat, the power vacuum left will create another series of crises in that region. It is quite likely that the Iraqi invasion of Kuwait will lead other Arab states to significantly expand their military spending and essentially intensify competition in this sphere. This places on us all, after these events are over, a special responsibility. The challenge facing the world in the aftermath of the immediate conflict will be to find constructive and enduring ways of safeguarding regional stability and security. The enhancing of support for the United Nations has given it a renewed sense of legitimacy and strength to act with certainty. International law assumes new meaning when it is given force and effect. The question of resolving the Middle East crisis requires continuing perseverance of the international community to promote negotiations between all parties. To forcibly impose a settlement on any party can be inherently fragile. The political and cultural character of the conflict means that a settlement will only last if it becomes embedded in the politics of the societies of the countries taking part. This will be no easy task. Australia should now constructively be encouraging the efforts of the United States, the United Nations and all parties in canvassing options to ensure the post-crisis regional security, stability and peace.
Order. The Honourable Minister for Community Services and Health.